Imagine the world as the ancients saw it. Their maps and manuscripts weren't just charts of lands and seas. They were true encyclopedias of wonders, alongside perfectly recognizable elephants, lions, and snakes. Creatures that take a modern person's breath away came to life on the parchment, and among them, with a troubling regularity, appeared depictions of people without heads, their faces located right on their chests. We've grown accustomed to dismissing this as the wild imagination of our ancestors, as myths and legends born from a fear of the unknown. But what if that's not the case? What if these aren't fantasies but documented eyewitness accounts? What if the respected historians of antiquity, whose works form the very foundation of our civilization, were describing an objective reality that we casually dismiss today? This question fundamentally changes our view of the past, forcing us to doubt the certainty of our knowledge. To unravel this mystery, we must turn to the primary sources, to men whose authority is beyond question. We are talking about titans of thought like Herodotus, rightly called the father of history. His work, The Histories, is not a collection of fairy tales, but a foundational text that laid the groundwork for Western historiography. And this is what the great Greek wrote about the distant lands of Libya. He meticulously describes the geography separating the sandy lands of the nomads in the east from the forested hills of the farmers in the west. Then, listing the fauna of the region, he places in a single line enormous snakes, elephants, bears, and men with the heads of dogs, as well as headless beings who, as the Libyans claimed, had their eyes on their chests. It's crucial to understand for Herodotus, this was not an allegory. He listed them as matter-of-factly as he did the other inhabitants of those lands. This wasn't fiction. It was information obtained from sources he considered reliable. Centuries later, he was echoed by another pillar of ancient science, Pliny the Elder. His natural history became the prototype for all modern encyclopedias, a colossal work that summarized the Romans' knowledge of the world. And in this work, Pliny speaks directly of a people called the Blemmyes. He writes, "They are said to have no heads, their mouths and eyes being seated in their breasts." Once again, we see not a myth, but a statement of fact recorded in a scientific treatise. Skeptics, of course, will find a simple explanation. They will say that ancient travelers might have encountered African tribes who wore terrifying ritual masks on their chests, hiding their heads under cloaks. This would create the illusion that the face was located on the torso. But this theory seems too simple. Were such inquisitive minds as Herodotus and Pliny really so naive as to mistake a costume for real anatomy? It's unlikely, especially since their own works described other no less astonishing peoples, which proves that the headless people were not an isolated anomaly. They were just one part of a whole long vanished world inhabited by the most incredible beings. For example, there were mentions of the skyopods, one-legged people who moved by jumping with incredible speed and in the heat sheltered from the sun in the shadow of their giant foot, or the gemtopes whose legs resembled the paws of animals. These descriptions suggest that we are dealing not with an error of observation, but with a global phenomenon, traces of which are scattered all over the world. Let's delve into the very essence of these accounts, setting aside modern skepticism for a moment. Herodotus, in describing the remote corners of Libya, doesn't write a separate chapter on myths. He methodically catalogues what, according to his information, inhabits that land. In his list, the strange but very real horned donkeys and venomous asps stand side by side with the Syphili, the dog-headed men, and the Blemmyes, the headless creatures. For him and his audience, this was a single body of knowledge about a distant and dangerous world. He makes no distinction, adds no footnote saying, "Here begins the fiction." He simply relays the information as any conscientious researcher of his time would. Pliny the Elder does exactly the same. His monumental natural history is an attempt to comprehend and systematize the entire known world. And in this grand catalogue of nature, alongside descriptions of minerals, plants, and animals, a short but clear note appears about the Blemm whose mouths and eyes are located on their chests. They are not characters from an epic poem, but objects of study, another form of life on this planet. Of course, the simplest and most tempting explanation that comes to mind is an error of interpretation. The rational mind immediately paints a picture. A warlike tribe seeking to intimidate its enemies employed a tactical trick. Warriors could have worn huge, fierce masks on their chests while hiding their own heads under a cloak, or ducking so low that from a distance it seemed as if they had no head at all. For an unprepared foreigner encountering such an army at twilight or in the heat of battle, the effect would have been stunning. This story, retold dozens of times, could easily have turned into a tale of an entire nation of headless people. It is a logical and convenient theory that allows us to maintain our familiar picture of the world. However, this neat version begins to crack as soon as we look more closely at the sources and their authors. To believe this theory is to admit that not only the greatest historians and encyclopedists of antiquity, but also the countless travelers, merchants, and soldiers whose stories they recorded fell victim to the same deception. Could such experienced and inquisitive men repeatedly mistake a ritual costume for actual physiology? It seems unlikely. But the main blow to the masquerade theory is the fact that the Blemmyes were far from the only strange beings described in ancient texts. They were just one of the so-called monstrous races. In the very same works, sometimes on adjacent pages, we find mentions of other amazing peoples. For example, the Skyods, inhabitants of India or Ethiopia. These people, it is reported, had only one but enormous leg on which they moved with astonishing speed, and during the midday heat, they would lie on their backs and raise their gigantic foot, using it as an umbrella to shield themselves from the scorching sun. The Greek writer Thesis described this tribe in detail, as well as people with dog heads. This shows that the Blemmyes were not a random anomaly taken out of context. They were part of an entire lost world, a disturbing and wondrous kaleidoscope of peoples whose existence questioned the very boundaries of the human form. And most strikingly, the geography of these wonders was not limited to Africa alone. Similar descriptions surfaced in the most diverse corners of the planet in cultures that seemingly had no connection with each other. If the stories of headless people were confined to the Greco-Roman world, they could be considered a unique cultural phenomenon, the product of a single region's imagination. However, the most astonishing thing is that this image is not a local legend, but a global mystery. It surfaces in cultures separated by thousands of kilometers and centuries of isolation, appearing with an obsessive and inexplicable precision. This is not just a coincidence. It is a pattern that demands an explanation. Let's travel east to ancient India and open the pages of the great epic, the Ramayana. There we meet a powerful demon named Kababand. His description is strikingly similar to the ancient Blem. He had no head or neck, and his single fierce eye blazed in the center of his stomach next to a huge mouth full of sharp fangs. His arms were incredibly long, allowing him like a spider to snatch his prey without moving from his spot. But Kab was not born this way. According to the epic, he was once a beautiful demigod, but due to a curse, his head was driven into his torso. He was doomed to remain in this monstrous form until the hero Rama freed him, granting peace to his soul. Here, the headless being is not just a curious animal, but a tragic character, the result of powerful sorcery. Now, let's go even further to the Celestial Empire and look into one of the most mysterious texts of Chinese antiquity, the Shanghai Jing, or the Classic of Mountains and Seas. This ancient treatise is essentially a bestiary describing the mythical creatures that inhabited the lands of ancient China. Among them, we find a deity named Xing Tian. This is no wretched creature, but a formidable and indomitable warrior. According to legend, he dared to challenge the supreme god Hongd, the Yellow Emperor. In a titanic battle, Xing Tian was defeated and the victor cut off his head. But even that could not stop him. The warrior spirit was so strong that he refused to surrender. His nipples turned into eyes and his navel into a mouth which continued to shout a battle cry. And to this day, as the myth goes, the decapitated Xing Tian roams the world, clutching a battle axe and a shield, ever ready for a fight. The pattern repeats itself. The loss of a head, a face on the torso, all linked to a punishment or the consequence of a great battle. Even in the isolated island culture of Japan, we find echoes of this strange image. In the rich world of Japanese folklore, populated by countless spirits and monsters known as yokai, there exists a creature known as the Donatuta, a headless man whose face is located on his torso. Unlike the epic figures of India and China, this creature is more often a frightening ghost. An encounter with whom on a deserted road boded ill. Now let's pause and grasp the scale of this. Ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, India, China, Japan. How could cultures separated by impassable mountains, merciless deserts, and vast oceans create such a specific and similar image? In those times, there were no global networks, no rapid exchange of information. Stories could not simply travel between civilizations. So, where does this startling similarity come from? Is it some universal archetype embedded in the depths of the human subconscious? Or are we dealing with something far more tangible, a common faint memory of a real creature that once truly inhabited our planet? This global consensus of myths did not fade with the fall of ancient civilizations. On the contrary, it gained a new life when the knowledge of the ancients migrated to the scriptorums of medieval monasteries. The stories of monstrous races were carefully copied and included in new books, bestiaries, and encyclopedias. They became an integral part of the medieval worldview. And at the center of many legends of that time was a figure whose name was known to all, Alexander the Great. In medieval Kiowalic romances, his real campaigns in the East were embellished with fantastical details, and according to these stories, the great conqueror did not just hear about headless people, he came face to face with them. The fall of Rome didn't bury these incredible stories. On the contrary, they found a second life in the silence of monastic scriptorums. Medieval monks transcribing ancient texts saw the world differently than we do. For them, there was no clear boundary between the natural and the supernatural. Therefore, the tales of the Blemmyes, Skyopods, and Syphili did not seem like fiction to them, but were perceived as reliable accounts of the wonders created by God in distant, unexplored lands. These creatures became firmly embedded in medieval culture, becoming an integral part of bestiaries, illustrated books of real and mythical beasts. In famous compilations like The Wonders of the East or the Book of Monsters, headless people were described with astonishing detail. One text speaks of a golden-skinned people about 3.5 meters tall who lived on an island in a river in Ethiopia. These legends so permeated the consciousness of the era that they even found their way into the biographies of the greatest heroes. Thus, in the numerous medieval versions of the story of Alexander the Great, his conquest took on a truly epic scale. According to these texts, during his campaigns in India, Alexander encountered not just enemy armies, but entire nations of monstrous beings, and among them were the headless. Ancient illustrations depict the meeting of the Macedonian king with these creatures. In prose versions of the legend, they are described as golden-skinned giants with beards reaching to their knees. A French version of the story even claims that Alexander was so astonished that he captured 30 such beings to show them to the rest of the world. Even if this episode is absent from the original Latin chronicles, the very fact of its appearance speaks volumes. For the medieval person, an encounter with a headless people was as plausible an event as any other military victory. This belief in the reality of monstrous races was not confined to scholars. It lived on in the tales of travelers. Perhaps the most famous of these was Sir John Mandeville, whose 14th century book on his travels in the East became a true bestseller. He claimed to have personally seen islands between India and Myanmar inhabited by headless people. He described how their eyes were located on their shoulders and their V-shaped mouth was in the center of their chest. Curiously, when his book was first printed, the illustrations inexplicably depicted them with smooth skin, even though Mandeville's text described them as rough and hairy like wild beasts. But the true climax of this centuries-long story. This was a time when misty legends were giving way to precise maps, and the world seemed on the verge of being fully explored and understood. And it is at this very moment in the year 1596 that the most astonishing and compelling piece of evidence appears. It was left not by a scribe monk or a storyteller, but by one of the most brilliant figures of his time, Sir Walter Raleigh, an English aristocrat, poet, scholar, and daring navigator. In his book, The Discovery of Ghana, fauna, Raleigh, describing his expedition into the interior of South America, reports with absolute confidence on the existence of a tribe of headless people whom the natives called the Panoma. He even specifies their location, the banks of the Kawa River. Raleigh isn't just repeating rumors, he insists on their authenticity, stating that this is no secret but a well-known fact. He writes that every child in the local provinces knows of their existence. Furthermore, he refers to a Spanish traveler who had allegedly seen these people with his own eyes. Raleigh was so convinced of their reality that he tried to find a rational explanation, suggesting that their heads were simply set so low between their shoulders that they appeared to be part of the torso, but his belief in their physical existence was unshakable. And this was not the opinion of one eccentric explorer. The belief in the Panoma was so strong that these creatures migrated from the pages of books onto the most advanced scientific documents of the era.